the irony is, leaving aside all the messiness about how these records were created and what they mean, they are now publicly available to everybody because they're public records. And reviewing enrollment applications has become one of my favorite new hobbies. Even if you don't have any connection to people, you can pull someone from random out of the collection and read just a fascinating snapshot of their family. We wanted, though, to compare the enrollment packets of Julia Ann Bee, our great-grandmother, and Rachel Ward, who was an enslaved person, as a mini case study comparing the experiences of those two women, because they grew up, as far as we can tell, on the same land, breathing the same air, and routinely experienced the churning clatter of the mill. They had equal rights to Cherokee citizenship in 1901, but they faced wildly different burdens of proof as the Dawes Commission performed their work. Julia Ann was Polly Beck's daughter with Stephen Hildebrand, and I'm going to pass it to Lara to explain a little bit about what we can see from Julia Ann's records.
So by the time of the commission, both of her parents were dead, and she was an adult, only a little older than we are today. The image we have that's reportedly of her is an interesting mix of both a photograph and hand-drawn embellishments. And you can see Julia Ann's record yourself, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. You can download the files from that site as a JPEG and then use a free software like IR Fan View to view and manipulate them if you want to. Don't be discouraged if the scans look fuzzy at first. They become more crisp when you view them as downloaded files. For example, page 2 of Julia Ann's file is flipped in the scan, and it has to be flipped back to be easily read. Julia Ann's record is fairly standard for a Cherokee citizenship application without any complications or unusual questions, despite reflecting a long childbearing career with several husbands and people who maybe weren't really husbands. The commissioners were able to find her name on previous census lists and noted the name changes that she made over 4 different marriages. They didn't closely question the paternity of her children, apparently relying on her testimony alone, supported by previous census records to include her kids as citizens. They didn't ask exact dates of marriages or seek any proof from any officiants. Her children at the time were listed as Charles Wolford, who was 25. His father was a man named Dan Wolford. Maddie Dial, 14. Her father was Martin Dial, who Julia Ann never married. Willora C.J. Bee, who was 11. Her name is very hard to read in the handwritten form, but family oral history is very clear on how she spelled her name, and it is correct on the typed manuscript. Julia Ann reported Willora's father as just B and stated that they were married at the time of her birth. Mary B was 6 years old. The commissioners appear to assume, as we do, that Mary and Willora have the same father. Some further asides about Julia Ann that aren't in this record. Mr. B's full name was Jasper Newton Tuck B. Tuck was his nickname. He died in 1941. He married Julia Ann in 1882. And it must have been some year for him, considering he has some records out of Fort Worth. We'll have a link to that. We have an image of him also. And then Julia Ann had at least one more child from the ones mentioned here. Her oldest son was John Beck, and he enrolled himself at age 29, and we have a link to his application. His age in 1901 suggests he was born right before his father died. He names his father as Black Soot Beck, which is the 5th spelling we found for Surry Eaton Beck. He's listed as Black S. Beck by the U.S. Marshal Service, and John is reportedly buried in Kansas. And is the reason we had to Google, is it legal to marry your first cousin? No one reports that he ever had any children or got married. So actually, he's also the only grandchild of Polly Beck that she would have known.
Yeah, so the irony is that for a while, I'm going to admit that I didn't. I knew Black Soot Beck was Julia's first husband, I'll admit for a little while, it actually made my family tree attempt awkward because I couldn't place him someplace else. And when I finally grasped that they were first cousins, it helped me understand where he should go. And part of what's interesting about this is it helped me kind of untangle. There's a distinction between the mill itself and kind of the miller versus the farm that surrounded the mill. And so just to give a little more context, Julia Ann, her mother Polly, and her father Stephen were living on the mill, and Julia Ann grew up on the mill, but apparently there was a whole farm surrounding that mill, and that included her Joe Beck, who was Stephen's brother, which makes Julia Ann and her first husband, Jesse Surry Eaton Beck, or Black Soot. It's spelled different ways in every single record. I'm only pretty sure it's him when I find him like that because he died at Going Snake. And
Yeah.
so generally, if the person they're talking about died in 1872, that's the right guy. So basically, it took me a little while to overcome my own assumption that, for example, if he had been Julia Ann's first cousin, that would have been mentioned anywhere. But no one said anything. Apparently, it wasn't that unusual. So,
I had a post-it note back here of John's exact birth date, and I don't remember where I put it now. But so poor Julia Ann, in the course of a few months,
like 5 months, basically. Yeah,
she lost her mother, and
she had a baby.
She had a baby. And I think the baby was 9 months old when her mother died. So she had a baby in 1871, her first child, and then her mother was murdered in February, and then I think was it April?
It was April, yeah.
And in April, she lost her husband, and
because he was shot to death trying to avenge her mother.
Yeah, avenge her mother's, or make sure that her mother received justice.
Yeah,
so
it's very Shakespearean when you kind of lump it together like that when you think about the timeline.
And then what's even weirder is some of the reason we even know what we would consider the family story about what happened to Polly is because we have a document that Julia Ann had to write, and as part of that documentation, she says the story of that because Zeke shot her, but he didn't mean to. Whether or not she believed it, that's what she wrote to the government.
So from an administrative standpoint, and full disclosure, I am actually a federal bureaucrat for my line of work. Julia Ann's documentation is relatively slim, and that suggests to me that the commission wasn't concerned. They were able to link her back to existing records. Her family was known. Apparently, from reading, through context on a couple other documents, especially her original father-in-law, was pretty pretty famous, if you will, regionally. The way that who the owner of the biggest car sales lot in your city is, kind of famous. Not famous like for doing anything, but because he was he had a big property with a lot of people. Joe Beck. So just being able to kind of connect her back to Joe Beck and connect her back to Polly and Stephen, which are her parents, that seemed to satisfy the commission that she was who she said she was, and that she was legitimately a Cherokee by quote blood or by birth. It's interesting because that matches all the stuff that we know from oral history and from other records. That's very satisfying. It's short, it's sweet. Rachel Ward, in comparison, the irony is there's a lot more documentation about her because, first of all, she was interviewed by the WPA narratives, and the Dawes Commission gave her a really hard time. In this book, on the narratives, she was interviewed when she was 91, and they gave her name as Rochelle Allred Ward. And if there hadn't been a footnote in this book with her Dawes enrollment number, we wouldn't be sure this is the same person. So I want to be clear, we're not guessing that Rachel Ward and Rochelle Allred Ward are the same people. Like someone, at least if we believe Lindsay Baker and Julie Baker, is the same person. She was living in Fort Gibson, Oklahoma at the time. And again, we found her because she talked about the mill in her narrative. And we posted a link to the full testimonies so you can read it in her own words. And I encourage you to do so, because it didn't feel right to us to read it out loud and to kind of documentize her words, but they're very powerful. And her testimony, for example, describes her parents' love story, how they navigated the desires of their enslavers to get married and build a life together and apparently have a loving, long relationship. Further, she talks about how her father changed his last name to Beck after her mother, Lottie, convinced Joe Beck to buy him from a woman named Surry Eaton. The last name Eaton suggests this person might also have been related to us, because we have a lot of Eatons on Polly's mother's side. From this testimony, we get a sense of her large family. Her parents had at least 7 children aside from her. Their names are Sabra, Celia, Milton, Louis, Sam, Nelson, and Dennis. Her Dawes enrollment packet is relatively slim compared to some other Freedmen's applications I have reviewed, even though it's bigger than Julia's. 15 pages. I've only looked at about 20 Freedmen records, but by and large, they seem to be more than 8 pages. Many of the non-Freedmen records are maybe 4, 5 at tops. They're very slim. I really hope someone spends some time analyzing these files because they're so rich. And ironically, the more the commission gave someone a hard time, the more information we now have. Children who enrolled with their mother are included on the front of her card with their father noted on the back. And the card wasn't completed in a single snapshot of time like a census. Children were added as they were born, if they were born during the commission's work. The ages given are the age they were when they were enrolled. Rachel lists herself as Cherokee by adoption in some documents, which may be how people were framing a Freedmen enrollment at the time. We've got a link to the record itself below. But I just wanted to kind of acknowledge these specific names and also these direct links back to their enslavers. The person first named on her card is Rachel. That's in Dawes enrollment number 775. Her father was James Beck, who died before 1880 and was enrolled in Tahlequah. Her mother was Lottie Beck, died before 1880 and was enrolled in Tahlequah. Both of them listed as being enslaved by Joe Beck. Her children, William Eldridge, 19 years old, Jesse Eldridge, 16 years old, Lewis Eldridge, 15 years old. Cora Ward was 4. Interestingly, her father is listed as Nelson Ward, a non-citizen, but again, in her testimony, she says he's a Cherokee by adoption, but also a U.S. citizen, so it's potentially a little confusing. Cora was born April 30th, 1897, and her midwife was Dina Walker. There's also Dan Van with 2 N's, V-A-N-N, 10 months old. His father was Jim Van, who was a freedman. And specifically, the application says that Rachel was not the wife of Jim Van, and her name is noted as Rachel Ward. Again, the clerk had to just do some scraping. It looks like the clerk originally wrote Van, had to kind of scrape with a penknife and write Ward over it. So it's actually really cool. You can see this kind of smooge on the document, even in the scan, 123 years later. Dan's birth record says he was born September 22nd in 1901, and he also had a midwife. In her 1930s testimony to the WPA, Rachel mentions having 13 children, only names Amos, Susie, Jess, Will, Frank, Lottie, and Cora. We have more details about her children and their fathers than we get out of Polly's record because the commission was more aggressive about questioning her personal history. So for all of these fathers who were married to her, they wanted to know if she couldn't give them a marriage certificate, they wanted to know where they were married, by who, is he dead, did they divorce, why isn't he the father of the next child? So because there's 3 different fathers, 2 of whom she was married to. So the commission, there's a couple of pages of testimony where they're questioning her, like, why isn't this guy, where's that guy? Is he alive? You know, where's he living? Blah, blah, blah. So back to who was Joe Beck. To be clear, we think that Joe Beck, who enslaved Rachel, her family, and several other families, was probably the father of Julia Ann's first husband. Again, listed in some records as Jesse Surry Eaton Beck, Soot Beck, Black Soot, or Black Soot. Interestingly, the Soot element of his name didn't strike me as funny until my husband read it and was kind of giggling about the Black Soot, like, you know, soot is black. And that's a sort of not as weird name to me as a Cherokee. So I guess it's funny. I don't know. But based on some of Julia Ann's documents actually helped me connect these people. Joe Beck was Polly's brother. Based on Julia Ann's 1906 testimony. So that forced me to finally kind of lock everybody in place and realize that Joe was Polly's brother, and therefore Jesse Surry Eaton Beck was Julia Ann's first cousin. And that's the connection to Joe, who was, according to several of the testimonies that I read, the enslaver of many people. And as Rachel said, all over this country was Beck families. She also mentions a mistress, who I think was Joe's wife, Cynthia Downing Beck, because she died before she could get back to Fort Gibson the next spring. And Cynthia Downing Beck died in 1863, which was right when everything was happening at Fort Gibson. So, Lara, did you want to close out our final thoughts on Rachel?
Well, I also want to jump back a little bit when you mentioned.
Sorry, did I skip something?
No. This isn't in the script, but the distinction between a Cherokee person and an American person, that sounds bizarre now because we're used to them overlapping. But Native Americans didn't technically become U.S. citizens until 1924.
Yeah.
So
in the time period of
100
documents, you were an American citizen or you were a Cherokee citizen. And actually, if you go and look in the archives and grab Tuck Bee's federal arrest warrants for his just wackadoo story, he's a whole separate video. He's nothing to do with this. But if you go and look at Tuck, they're very specific in the turn of the century records in the what year was it? We figured out the year. Hold on.
For Fort Gibson?
Yeah, that was that same year, 72.
Yeah.
And 1872, they're very specific that he's a white man and an American citizen living in Indian Territory, and that the victim of his crime was also a white man living in Indian Territory. What's the matter? You're looking for something?
I was seeing if it was 1882. That's when they got married.
Oh, sorry, I'm confusing myself. Sorry, 72 was when she had her first child. Sorry, yeah. So a decade later, here's the interesting part, and this might actually be partly because of what happened at Going Snake. A decade later, the warrant put out for who would have been, if she was alive, Polly's son-in-law's arrest warrant is very explicit out of Fort Gibson that he is a white man and that he assaulted another white man. And even though they were both living in Indian Territory and they're both American citizens, and that's why it's okay for the marshal to go across the border and go get him and take him back to Texas for trial. And I mean, it seems unlikely to me that this wasn't, that it's so explicit. And I want to say, and I'm not a legal historian, but I don't think in other parts of the country you get that level of specificity about the person's race and nationality. So it's written like, and because it is like an extradition attempt, and it's very specific that they are going into Indian Territory to get this white man and an American and distinguish him from the Cherokee citizens that are also living there, partly because of all the mess that happened after Going Snake. So if you guys want to dive into that, we can do a separate video with that. Tell us in the comments if you want to hear more about Jasper talk, because it's a little bit of a, you need to strap in. It's a little bit of a wild ride. That's when I would feel comfortable putting on a fake mustache and a hat and like reading out documents, because it is wackadoo. And his testimony, you're reading it, and I was literally yelling out loud, "No, Jasper, don't say that in the courtroom. What's the matter with you?" Like, never say that. Like, you need a lawyer. So we might pull together a little dramatic reading circle for that with some actual lawyers, because he needed someone to object to his own testimony.
So with all that said, our final thoughts on Rachel are that we really encourage you to read Rachel's testimony for herself in her own words, rather than try to listen to us, quoting her or potentially, at least giving you the gist of the story. She paints a relatively rosy picture of life, being enslaved at the farm surrounding the mill, and of Cynthia specifically, possibly out of concern that otherwise her testimony wouldn't be recorded. On a positive note, her words do ring with pride on her family's skilled labor and relationship building.
So that's our weird positive note. We've got a lot of links in the chat, in the comments, or the links are in the description box. And definitely, if you want to know more about what we found out about different people, that's you can let us know in the comments, and we'll do our best. This is our last video where we're really going to focus on a deep dive into our family's direct participation in enslavement, although it's, of course, always part of the context, and we can't, especially now that we're making specific attempts to display the relative wealth and privilege of some of these people. We're being especially mindful that you can't have that. You don't get a beautiful silk gown, especially in Indian Territory after the removal, without participation in slavery. And aside from just generally the entire culture being kind of soaked in it, there's very specific ways that people were potentially leveraging their privilege to kind of soften the blows of American imperialism, partly through enslavement of other people, which is, despite some of these loving descriptions of relationships with specific enslavers, there's just a lot of violence required for that throughout the system. And my family is home, so
violence I hear children.
Is there background noise of like the delighted, sweet little voices of children? Like pitter patter of little descendant feet